the core capability for this moment in time is how do we see new potential that is not rooted in the way things have been. Well, it's been a very freeing experience in many ways, and it's completely changed the way I see everything. All of this actually feels very simple. Are we respecting each other? Are we learning history and context? Are we operating with the understanding that we are really all one? There is no separation. Every major religion says it at its core. Every esoteric tradition says it. Every time people do psychedelics, they see it. And so seeing the world in that way, so many structures that aren't serving us can fall away, and you can see the world with such different eyes. So it actually makes really practical, good business sense, too. It's like we can build more resilient, longer, enduring companies. Why don't we go back to the core of things in order to figure out how to move forward? Let's ditch a bunch of our assumptions and build something new that serves the whole.
Welcome to the FutureKind podcast, where conscious nourishment is our guide. From the cellular to the cosmic, we're exploring how our relationship with food has the power to transform the world. Lauren Tucker, welcome to FutureKind.
Hi, Megan Westgate.
Thanks for being here. I'm thinking about looking at you. I'm thinking about the first time, I think it was the first time we met in person. We were at the Natural Products Expo West, which is the biggest or one of the biggest natural products trade shows in the world. And it was before COVID. So I'm thinking like maybe 6 or 7 years ago.
Yeah.
And I remember like it was definitely a kindred spirit moment of feeling like I've known you for longer than this. And then like the journey that we've been on the last few years as I've been in the ReNourish Studio cohort learning from you about living systems thinking has like helped close the loop of like, oh, I was remembering this future thing that was going to happen. So I'm excited to talk about all of that journey. But before that, kind of want to back up to like what got you to that moment where you were on this trade show floor in Anaheim doing food systems work. And I don't think I actually like really fully know like what called you into working on food systems, like all the way back to like from how you grew up, things about your education, like what is it that brought you to that moment?
Yeah, that moment, sometimes you remember meeting someone and it's really clear. I definitely have like a video picture of meeting you for the first time. And I think I walked up to the booth and said something such as, how is Non-GMO Project working on regenerative agriculture? Or are you working on regenerative agriculture? Or something like that. And because I was leading Kiss the Ground at the time and we were looking for partnership and I was genuinely curious. And yeah, it feels like a very long time ago at this point. Yeah, I never quite know where to start with this question. And, I'm turning 40 this year, which feels significant. And now I can tell a really beautiful story about my life and how it makes sense and how I've just been following one thread since I was young. There's, a pretty story we can tell about it. But the truth is that it was very much one foot in front of the other, stumbling over things. And really, I think I have shown up with so much curiosity my entire life. And that's really helped me just discover beautiful communities and information and be able to participate in the most unusual projects. And so I think that's really the thread I've been following in a way. But I grew up in rural West Virginia, so we make jokes about West Virginia. It's quite the joke of the United States. But I actually grew up in a really beautiful small town, the oldest town in West Virginia as far as colonized settler towns. It was founded in the 1700s and has cobblestone streets and brick buildings, and is really close to where two rivers meet. And they thought about putting the nation's capital there, but didn't because they couldn't get the barges up the river. So I grew up close to Washington, D.C., surrounded by farmland, small college town. And so surrounded by ideas from all over the world, like Tibetan monks would fly in and do singing bowls. And there was a theater festival where they tested Broadway shows before they went to Broadway to see how they did. And so I had this very kind of quaint liberal childhood in a very rural food system. And my mom hated cooking and was super liberated by the microwave. So I ate a lot of TV dinners, a lot. And I think that now I can say from a very young child that I've been seeking understanding why we aren't nourished as people and communities and why we aren't nourishing the earth as we nourish ourselves. And that I've really been following that thread, asking, how come people are unwell? How come we have emotional baggage? How come we have generational trauma that continues to get passed and passed? And how come that's all wrapped up in our food? And why do we eat toxic food? And why is farmland so extracted from? And so, yeah, I think my childhood planted that seed that just grew over time. And then the maybe shorter version of the story is I went to school for international studies. I thought I was going to save starving kids in Africa. My university education was actually really incredible and had me question that premise quite significantly. And I traveled abroad, studied abroad in Ghana, and realized how much of a political tool foreign aid was. And I did a thesis understanding the impact of foreign aid on local economies, and especially food aid. So in my thesis, I looked at 3 different examples, and in all 3, from the moment the food aid was requested to the moment it arrived, was about 6 months. And so clearly those people who were hungry went hungry. And it, the effect was to dump really inexpensive imported food onto markets that didn't need it, and then create dependency in a globalized system. So I did my thesis on that, graduated college, had no clue what I was going to do. Moved to New Orleans because it sounded really fun as a 21-year-old, and it was post-Katrina, and I could do anything. I mean, young people were building homes, we were planting gardens, we were getting involved in energy efficiency, rebuilding, and I got involved in a lot of different things. And that's where I think the seed of food really started to grow in me. And then I got pregnant very young, and moved to California with no plan, and landed in Northern California. And the only person that would hire me, a young pregnant lady with no plan, was a small organic farm store. And so I got to sell people these sweet organic veggies every day and do a little grant writing on the side and somehow figure out how to be in California. And then that seed really grew in me. It was the first time I had experienced such fresh food. Growing up in West Virginia, everything's shipped from everywhere. And even though there's a lot of farmland there's actually not a ton of local fresh veggies and food, actual food. And so, yeah, this bug of like eating really healthy grew in me. And then I moved to LA and tried a lot of different things and ended up taking a permaculture design certificate. And that led to working in a restaurant while trying to figure out what in the world you do with a permaculture design certificate for a living. And then I met Ryland Engelhart and Finian Makepeace and a bunch of friends in Venice, California. And Ryland got super inspired by soil carbon sequestration, hosted all these living room meetings, and that became the beginning of Kiss the Ground. And that was 2013. And so I kind of stumbled into helping to grow a global movement for regenerative agriculture. And we were young and we were ambitious and we were really excited and we were really scared about climate change. And that fueled our work in sharing about soil carbon sequestration as a climate change solution. And I spent about 7 years at Kiss the Ground helping to grow that movement. And it took me all over the world. I flew all over the world and worked with companies and nonprofits and farmer groups, figuring out how you actually get people excited about the potential of regenerative agriculture. And we created films and educational curriculum and all these things. And in 2020, I left the organization. Even though I was a co-founder, I left because I was actually really unsure about the theory of change. And I wasn't sure at that point that education was really what we needed in order to evolve our food system to really nourish humans and planet simultaneously. And so, yeah, I left seeking something new. And I had been part of a school with Carol Sanford, really working on learning how to think or learning how to examine the assumptions of my thinking. And that led to this kind of itch in me where I couldn't keep doing the work that I had been doing. And so I went to work with White Buffalo Land Trust, and I've done a lot of regenerative supply building projects with them, all multi-stakeholder convenings. I've done work in cotton growing in California, still doing work in almond growing, building a market for regenerative almonds, which at the end of the day really feels like we're trying to decommodify a commodity system so that the market can actually value the highest form of land stewardship and learn so many lessons. I mean, when I was at Kiss the Ground, I was like, why don't farmers, stop using chemicals? What's wrong with them? Like, I was definitely on a high horse about it. And this experience of really learning to examine my own thinking over a long period of time, plus going to work directly with farms and getting really humbled and realizing that farms care a lot about their land and chemicals are part of the business model. And when we have a food system that puts so much downward economic pressure on the farm to squeeze every last drop out of it, that chemicals and scale and monocultures are kind of the only answer to surviving in a financial system. And so I got really humbled through those projects. I've since done some work in the native Western blue elderberry, building a market for a quote unquote crop that isn't in the marketplace yet. And I'm being called to do a few more of those projects. And then I said I would make this short, but I don't think I have. The last thing I want to add
so interesting
is that, so I've been doing those regenerative supply projects and still do, and really believe in the power of pre-competitive collaboration, bringing brands and farms and processors and folks who compete in the marketplace together to work on something in a collaborative way. And I really enjoy doing those projects. And then the other thing that happened is I started something called ReNourish Studio in 2021. And that started as a phone call from a friend at Farmer's Footprint who wanted me to actually start a venture studio for regenerative ag. And I said yes. And then we got a few months into the design process and realized that there was something else that really wanted to emerge that was not figuring out new ventures for regenerative agriculture. And so we created a 3-year cohort that is just ending. And what we ended up creating was a developmental community for food business leaders to really get to the roots of our thinking. And so I went deep, took a leap into the deep end of how do you create a developmental container? How do we work together to see new potential? How do we apply a living systems understanding of the world to business? And is that even possible? And what does that look like? And so we've been leading that cohort, and it's now coming to a close. And we're really in the question of, we're very clear what needs to evolve in the food system, but we're in the question of what structure our work is going to take next beyond just our one-on-one consulting with clients. So I guess I'll pause. That was a lot. You asked me to tell my life story. I don't know.
I know it's pretty good telling a life story in 13 minutes or something. So I'm thinking about the thread of, you talked about like the threads of curiosity and specifically being curious about the question of like, why aren't we nourished with our food and with our community? And so as I was listening to those different chapters, I was thinking about how those threads weave through, and I definitely want to like go deeper into a few of those chapters. Maybe to start, I'm curious about, you spoke to the shift in your thinking of questioning the theory of change around doing education. And I think that would be interesting to explore because it's kind of a provocative idea. And for those who don't have experience with Carol Sanford, well, if that's true, I highly recommend her books as a starting point. But just like for those who don't have experience with living systems thinking, if you could maybe illuminate for us, like what was moving in your thinking that led you to question that? Like what were the new thoughts that were emerging? What was the potential you were sensing that wasn't being met by that approach?
Yeah. I think that education is really important. And when I left Kiss the Ground, I had a hard time articulating quite what was brewing in me around the what felt like a mismatch with the theory of change. And I remember being in meetings and having heated discussions where people are saying, "Lauren, you literally don't believe in education." I'm like, no, I believe in education. Just I'm not quite sure our approach is working. And I think what I was seeing is that we had just followed kind of an activist playbook. And, what we were sensing was that humans could play a really keystone role on the planet as earth tenders. And it's actually what all our ancestors believed, I think, and what we learned from indigenous cultures that are still intact today, is that that's our kind of right working as a role of a human on the planet. And, I was born in the 80s. My entire life, I've been aware of climate change and have held a lot of fear around it until pretty recently. And do no harm was always the narrative that was shared. And I really internalized that. And I think the spark of hope that happened for me at the beginning of Kiss the Ground was, oh, wow, instead of being told to minimize my actions, there's a way in which I can contribute more and just live a nice life and care for the planet at the same time, that they're actually one, that our our joy and our personal nourishment and the nourishment of our family and our community is the same as the thriving and joy and nourishment of the land, and that it's actually inseparable. But that thought wasn't fully articulated for me at the time. It was still brewing. And so I think what I was craving is integration. There's so much knowledge in the world. So, I mean, you can read endless stacks of books and watch incredible documentaries and then go to work and, not have the tools or the community to challenge the norms. And it's like, well, this is just how business is done. And that's how I felt I was approaching Kiss the Ground as a leader. Is I was like, well, this is just how nonprofit activism is done. You make a film, you make a curriculum, you public speak, you find donors that care about what you're doing, and you just, so we were just carrying out this plan. And I was trying to pull myself out of that, that kind of preordained plan and really go back to, okay, what are the capabilities we need to build as humans to actually shift our extractive food system? And our food system right now is a system first for making cash. It's the main motivation of our food system is efficiency and scale and financial viability. And when I say that, it's not a judgment, it just is. And our food system is incredible. It feeds so many humans, and it's really food safe and it's reliable. And I go to the grocery store and there's always food there. And I'm so grateful for it. But, I'm really curious about what if our food system at its highest goal, at its highest kind of directive, was a system for nourishing all life. And there was something brewing in me that I needed to go discover and figure out how to articulate and then how to work on. And so all the projects I've done since have been attempts at how do we integrate all of the immense knowledge with the way we're being, and how do we evolve our businesses to be in different ways? How do we evolve the system itself to be meeting different goals? And so that's what I've been working on is that question around integration.
And I'm so glad that you have been, because I've been a direct beneficiary, as has our whole non-GMO project organization, participating in the ReNourish Studio cohort and learning from you and with you about those, what are those capabilities that we need to build to actually evolve the food system, and so much work around. I remember I was actually just sharing this with the team yesterday. So in this lineage of living systems thinking, there's a lot of frameworks to help structure our thinking. And I remember something that you said about what the frameworks help us do, which has really stuck with me, which is about holding more complexity and observing our own thinking. And so those have, I really have experienced those to be fundamental capacities that are typically underdeveloped in Western education and business, and results in what you were describing at Kiss the Ground of here's the playbook that we follow without, and that's a lot of linear thinking behind that, where we make things smaller and simpler so that they can be executed on a timeline and with checkboxes, but it doesn't actually honor the fullness, the true fullness of what's happening. And yeah, so those ideas of how do we hold more complexity and be with, it can feel overwhelming to really see all of the integrated parts of a whole. But if we don't do that, then then we're not really in the truth of what is. And also if we're not observing our own thinking. I'm really curious about that idea of the playbook. And one of the things that I think in holding complexity and observing thinking, one of the things that I am continuing to learn that I've gotten a really good foundation with from participating in the studio cohort is to really think about who is any given effort, like, how is this adding value? Who specifically is it adding value for? And like, what will change as a result of that? And that's what I find over and over in those playbooks kind of gets missed, where we can get enchanted with a good idea and just do it for the sake of doing it because it seems kind of like the right thing or what other people are doing. And if we're not really considering how does this add value and what does it make possible that wouldn't be possible otherwise? And I just have experienced participating in the studio cohort just how beautifully you've brought that alive for all of us. And I would love to just talk more about like what you've designed and what you've been learning in that journey. And yeah, going all the way back to, it's been almost 3 years since our first in-person gathering by a river in the deep rainforest of Oregon, like one of the absolutely most magical experiences of my life. I came home and told my family, like, I had no idea. And I think part of what that sparked for me is like the potential, like you're saying, of like our state of being and that integration and like not just thinking about things, but like the full embodiment of it. So I would just love to hear anything you want to share about what you've been holding in mind as you were designing that whole arc of the cohort experience, the value of the in-person gatherings, and from that lens of like tracking to like what's the capability that we need to build and how do we do that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that the core capability for this moment in time is how do we see new potential that is not rooted in the way things have been. And it's almost breaking our obsession with incrementalism and kind of continuous improvement. And this goes back to actually how I now see regeneration, which we don't have to define it. That has been a panel question for about the last 10 years. How do you define regenerative agriculture? What does regeneration mean to you? But to me, I've really come to understand it as a process and not a thing. And the process of regeneration, it requires going back to the core of something. So the core of you, Megan, as a human, the core of the non-GMO project as an entity, the core of, you were just talking about Oregon, the core of, Trout Creek, Oregon as a place and its uniqueness. And seeing new potential from the core of an entity and its interaction with the actual reality of this moment in time. And I think we get really stuck in, well, this is what I did last year, and this is what I can do this year, and now I have this new capability, so now I can do this. And we're getting really far from the core of maybe even what we care about. And so I think it's really important. We're living through a time period on the planet where a lot of the systems and structures that were created very intentionally. I mean, the U.S. food system, as we know it today, was very intentionally created around World War I and World War II for allowing people to move off land, for allowing people to move into cities, for allowing for less human hands to be involved in the growing and processing of food and for efficiency. And then, so how do we consciously design the systems and structures that are going to serve people, places, cultures, communities into the future? I think we need to be able to see new potential that's not with the blinders of our just kind of what we know. And that's been the beauty of working with a group of people. I think the invitation was, hey, do you want to step into the unknown with us and work on evolving our businesses in service to evolving the food system? And we don't quite know what this journey is going to entail, but we're going to use frameworks that help us think outside the box. And that's just been so magical. It's been a very freeing experience in many ways. And it's completely changed the way I see everything. And at first it felt very complicated. It's like, okay, I need to understand principles of regeneration. I need to understand what I'm tracking in my thinking. I need to be able to separate, oh, I can identify this is mechanistic thinking, or this is do-good thinking, or, oh, this might be regenerative thinking. I need to be able to track all this stuff. And now it felt overwhelming and confusing. Even though we were leading the container, it still felt like that. And then over the years,
which I love, by the way. I just want to say that, like, I think that's a capability, to be willing to be leaders and not sourcing that from like, I'm only a leader if I know all the answers. Like, the leaders we need in this time, I believe, like a core leadership quality is being willing to lead by stepping into the big questions that no one has answers for. And if we're pretending that we do, it's just that, it's pretending. So I just want to underscore, like, I've learned a lot from watching you do that, of like, this is leadership, actually. Let's be in the uncertainty and like keep moving forward anyway.
Thank you. It's been the greatest joy that we've all gotten to be peers and colleagues in that sense in the work, while still holding the role of leading the energy and the direction of a container. It's been really joyful. But now at this moment in time, all of this actually feels very simple. So it went from like cloudy and confusing and complex to very simple. And I said this recently on a panel, and I don't mean it offensively, but honestly, it kind of feels like kindergarten. Like, are we respecting each other? Are we learning history and context? Are we operating with the understanding that we are really all one? There is no separation. Every major religion says it at its core. Every esoteric tradition says it. Every time people do psychedelics, they see it. I have come to believe it really just is the truth, is that humans and places and cultures and all of it, it's one living entity, and we're all just these nested kind of entities inside. And so seeing the world in that way, so many structures that aren't serving us can fall away, and you can see the world with such different eyes. So it's like, if you see a business that is operating just for the sake of grabbing more market share, you can see, well, you're actually going to undercut your viability in the long term. And because, that's going to come back to bite you at some point. And so it actually makes really practical, good business sense too. It's like, we can build more resilient, longer enduring companies that can see that they're inseparable from their suppliers, that can see that we are all in the same boat. If the farm is failing, then the processor can't process anything. If the retailer closes its doors, then everyone who's been depending on that retailer doesn't have a market anymore. Like, we're really literally all connected. And so, yeah, it just now seems very practical to me. And kind of basic. It's like, why don't we treat each other with respect? Why don't we, go back to the core of things in order to figure out how to move forward? Let's ditch a bunch of our, assumptions and build something new that serves the whole.
So what do you think gets in the way of that? Because there's I'm resonating with what you describe as that journey from like all the complexity and vagueness into simplicity. And I've experienced that a number of times with different dimensions and layers of work of like really trusting that when things land in that simple point, like that's the truth. And but that like, can you get to that simple clarity without that journey? I guess that's a question I have of like, what in your own process has enabled you to get to a place where it seems simple? And for someone listening who's like, yeah, that makes sense, what might get in the way when they go back to work tomorrow and there's the inertia of all of these systems that are set up to, in opposition to that truth of interconnectedness and interdependence. Everything is set up to be in competition and fragmentation. So like, how do you think we develop the capacity to hold that simple, essential truth in the face of all of these systems that, I mean, it is kind of mind-boggling how much of our modern systems really are in direct opposition to basic truths. It's like quite a thing to be up against.
Yeah. I'm not sure I have the answer to that, but what I've come to is actually, if we're all one, that means if I work on my own development and dealing with my own generational family traumas and my own nourishment, and then I care for my family, and then that extends out to caring for my community, and then I can bring my different way of being to work. If we were to all actually do that, it would be different. And, I am seeing this energy all over the place right now. And I see it mostly because I was this person, but it's like the warrior activist energy where you're like, okay, I see that the regeneration of the planet is essential. So I'm going to put all these farmers on my back. I'm going to put all these companies on my back, and I'm going to like work really hard to climb to the top of the mountain. But it's like, but are you taking care of yourself? Are you tending earth in the ways that you're preaching about it? Like, what does your garden look like? What's on the table for dinner? How's your inner being? And I'm not suggesting that we can all just like check out and be self-centered, but it's something I'm really curious about right now. It's like, if we are martyrs in service of land regeneration, we've missed the point. It's like, I actually think we're all wrapped up together. It's like we have to heal ourselves while we heal the planet. We have to heal ourselves while we heal our communities. And heal is kind of a weird word because it assumes that something's wrong, where I just view all of this as an evolution. It's like a forest keeps evolving to greater states of biodiversity and complexity, and new species emerge and new flowers show up, and some things compost and die away. And so I think that's actually, that's how life on this planet works, and we're so busy trying to fight it that we forget that. I feel like I lost my train of thought.
You said a little while ago about, you said until recently that you were really scared about climate change. Listening to what you were just sharing makes me think, like, I'm guessing a lot of people heard that and thought, like, what, you're not scared now? So maybe if you could draw the connection between, like, that line of reflection and, like, how that relates to your current relationship with climate change.
Yeah. I do think that the climate is changing. It doesn't snow as much as it used to where I grew up. We've all experienced some form of the climate being different. So it's not that I don't believe in a, like, is it happening or not? I just realized pretty recently that I've been carrying the weight of climate change as my mission. I've been carrying that in the heavy bag and trying to walk up the mountain. as if it was mine to do in this lifetime. And I think I finally let that go and realized that it's almost by hyper focusing on climate change, then there's a good guy and a bad guy, and then we're in fragmentation again. And what if we were to focus on, healthy, thriving systems? If we focus on healthy, thriving systems, and I focus first on caring for myself, and then it ripples out to my family and my business and my contributions to my community, then climate change is obsolete. If we can really consider our actions nested inside the health of the community that we live in. And so, yeah, I guess I just stopped thinking about it in the same way. And that's been a huge weight lifted off my shoulders. And I now see actually, new ways to work on it that are less divisive and less, less like preachy.
It's making me think about just this core idea in living systems, thinking of orienting to potential instead of problems, because we're taught so much to like identify problems and solve the problems and fix them, which gets into that like, the activist, savior, do good kind of mentality that a lot of us have been conditioned to.
Yeah.
And I think, I'm appreciating that what you're saying and want to like emphasize this is it's not about not caring. It's about a different orientation to what it is. And so, what do you see as possible through that shift of like looking at the potential instead of the problem? What is possible in how you're showing up for the considerations related to climate change that wasn't possible when you were in a more of like a do-good, carrying it up the mountain mentality?
Yeah. Well, I think the example that's coming to mind is pretty funny, but I overheard someone we were both just at Natural Products Expo West. I overheard someone saying, "Oh yeah, I ran into that guy. He was at that funny climate day thing stuck in the corner. Oh, it was so sad." And it's that energy, right? Like when you're so busy trying to convince everyone that we should all care about climate change, we're missing where the energy actually is. It's like the rest of the companies who aren't at Climate Day, where's their energy? Oh, they're trying to be viable in the marketplace. Oh, they're trying to deal with tariffs. Oh, they're trying to find investment. They're trying to sell into retail stores. Let's meet them there. Oh, hey, how are you working on selling into retail stores? Oh, actually, if we were to look at your business and its inseparability from the farms you source from and from the retailers, we could actually help you maybe sell more cases. So we miss this opportunity to go where the energy is and meet people where they are and evolve from there when we're so busy trying to like convince people to jump on board the climate train. And so I think, that's an example. And what I've experienced in working on Almonds is we started with a 5-year scientific study. And the scientific study was looking at pretty basic soil health practices in both conventional growing land and organic growing land. And we got everyone to the table. It was several brands, processor, farms, a nonprofit as a convener. And because science takes a long time, we were in relationship. We have been in relationship for a very long time. And so what have we been doing? We've been learning to stand in each other's shoes and view, what's the perspective of the almond marketplace from a company's perspective, from a small one, from a medium one, from a large one? What's the perspective of the farm? What's the perspective of the processor? Oh, now we all actually care about each other and we realize that our businesses are inseparable. oh, okay, so now we can work on building a market for regenerative almonds in a very different way. If we can build a marketplace that cares about tending land in ways that will sequester carbon, that's actually great for climate change. But it's no longer a climate change project. It's a project about relationship. And it's like, I really care about these processors. I really care about these farms. So I'm like, let's figure out how to sell these almonds. Right? Yeah, with all these considerations of what's the potential here.
Which makes me think about how, like, in building the capacity to, again, not go by a playbook, but really be able to consider how could this add value and for whom. Part of what you're pointing to in that is, like, we have to really deeply understand the different stakeholders and players that we're interacting with most immediately, and then, like, the ripples out from there. Otherwise, we don't really know what would add value, and we don't have that also, like, relational web that makes us feel really compelled to do what we can to contribute that value.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about what non-GMO has gone through in this process.
Yeah.
So, I want to start with what was so fun for me at the beginning of working with you all is looking at your core essence. We've been talking about regenerating from a core seed. And as someone who sees the non-GMO standard in the marketplace, I was not clear at all what that core seed was. I was like, oh, they're reliable. They reliably help us determine if something is or is not genetically modified. But the core seed was much more, it was around like food sovereignty. And share a little bit about that and then what has been your process and through this work.
Well, you spoke to earlier about, like, launching the cohort with, just the open-endedness of, we don't fully know, but here's basically what it is. And we were definitely one of those companies that was, like, enthusiastically raising our hand right away of, like, that sounds great. And the reason that we had will for that is we had been working for years already at that point of really deeply considering, in the context of the poly crisis, how do we make our best possible contribution to the well-being of life on Earth in these times? And yes, we care about non-GMO, but that is not ever, like, non-GMO is not ever anyone's exclusive, isolated concern. So we had been digging deep for years to, like, try to come back into conscious relationship in a way that we could articulate about, like, why do we care about non-GMO? Like, why did I work all those 70-hour weeks before I had kids and could do such things of, like, this felt, like, so deeply important. And, like, by reconnecting with that, like, what would that mean for what else we could do, where else we could contribute? And in that exploration, we, like, did a lot of development, a lot of deep thinking, and shortly before you launched the studio, had started doing some work directly with Carol Sanford. And just from that little bit of a taste of, like, understanding what does, like you said, regeneration as a process, it's as a process that doesn't just apply to agricultural practices. It's a process that we use in our thinking, in our businesses. Like, how does, and, like, really I've come to see the arc that we've been on, especially since joining the studio cohort, as regenerating the non-GMO project, like, really coming back into what are we here for. And there is definitely an essence of sovereignty about that. And, like, our essence is about, like, sovereign co-creation, the power that we all have to co-create a food system that truly nourishes life. And what are all the aspects of that, and how, with our position working with 6,000 brands and, as a nonprofit that was founded by retailers and also has a lot of direct relationship with consumers, which is a unique thing that a lot of certifications don't have. Like, we've since the beginning had this direct communication across social media and other avenues of directly engaging with shoppers and eaters. So from that position, also with expertise in standards and certification, how do we make a contribution that is in line with all of that? And in that process for us too, there's been a lot of messiness. I mean, I was like laughing to myself earlier when you were describing launching the studio, like reflecting on some of the board meetings I've had in the past few years. And one of my amazing board members at one point of like different iterations of launching ideas related to like how we like expand our platform and articulate what we're doing. He's like, so basically we're all agreeing to just like hold hands and leap into the unknown, right? Like, okay, let's do it. And he's like an amazing, this is John Foraker, former CEO of Annie's, CEO of Once Upon a Farm, like absolutely legend in the food system with like, yeah, just so much integrity and also like, well-earned influence. So it was really helpful to me to have him like, yeah, let's do that. But I just think back on that moment of it did in order, and like it related to what I said earlier about the kind of leadership that I think these times call for, like in order to do what you were describing of not just sourcing from like incremental improvements from things we've done before, it does require being in the discomfort and vulnerability of the unknown. And when we have all been conditioned to having our authority and leadership credentials be based on having all the answers to everything, that is a really difficult edge to lean into. And my experience working with you, learning with you in the cohort is it's given me a lot of confidence and foundation. I mean, you know, I always get teased in the cohort for how much I love all the frameworks, but I find that so
You're a very
useful
good
to
student.
have. Well, it's like if you're replacing all of these other structures and ways of thinking, it's hard to just like erase them. So I find it very useful to have like other scaffolding to put in place that actually is more useful in service of like, how do I make sure that I'm actually tracking to and working on the things that I care about and not just like the old playbook that's getting repeated. But we do need like a structure and scaffolding to keep ourselves organized and moving forward. And so, yeah, through that process of being in that cohort with you, we've launched the Food Integrity Collective, which involves articulating a platform of 8 petals of food integrity that all connect to like help us see the relatedness of human health and the health of everything else. And then through that process, one of the petals is minimal processing and additives. Non-GMO is another one, regenerative sourcing and biodiversity, healthy human communities. The Food Integrity Collective website has all that info. But through working on that, then considering like, where are there gaps? Where does this food system need to be resourced to be able to step into the potential that's here across these petals? And that led us to just this past January launch the non-UPF verified certification, because under the petal of minimal processing and additives, we realized like there's no work really happening to define and resource the food industry to think about how to meet the demand that's there with consumers who are trying to figure out what is non-ultra processed. How do I easily find that? But another thing that led to us focusing on that program was not only that there was a gap there, but also that through learning about living systems thinking, I've experienced how hard it is, how rigorous the work is of changing our paradigm and changing our thinking. And it sounds kind of simple and obvious, but again, back to like appreciating when you get to those simple points, it's like to be able to do the work of holding more complexity and observing our thinking, we actually have to be nourished. And we're seeing all of these data points showing us that as humans globally, our cognitive capacity is eroding in ways that I find extremely concerning. And so we're basically like at opposing directions of, on the one hand, like we need like never before in order to reclaim our role as a keystone species. Like we need to be really developing our thinking, being able to hold more complexity and observe ourselves more clearly. And yet our capacity is lower than it's ever been and going down. And there's just a lot of evidence that the ultra processing of our food is a direct contributor to that. And so it is kind of a lower order intervention. And that's another thing that I've learned from the living systems frameworks is like, it's not only about always being at the regenerative paradigm. There's all these levels of paradigms that are nested within each other. And the way that you work at a lower order intervention, like we need to not have our food be toxic, is the way that we're working on that is different because of how we're learning to think about the bigger potential, again, like within the umbrella of the Food Integrity Collective, like all of the things that need to be considered. We can't only work in isolated ways, but we also do need to work on those individual issues in very like deep, thoughtful ways. So yeah, I attribute my learning with you for, I attribute a lot of how our organization has evolved to the things that I've learned from you, and not only in the cohort, but through the resourcing and consulting work that has allowed our entire organization to be learning how to work developmentally, which is a whole other thing besides just like the what we are working on and how we're thinking about it. It's like how as an organization are we actually able to do that? It's being resourced to completely change like our hierarchies of thought and contribution so that every human in the organization is valued for their contributions and like their unique aliveness and essence and how that matches to what we're all tracking to. So it's a long ongoing journey. And yeah, I don't know if I fully answered your question, but I do want to honor everything that I've gleaned in the past few years of working with you, and I'm continuing to. And I'm really curious about for organizations that didn't have the opportunity to be in ReNourish Studio cohort or learn directly from Carol when she was alive, like how do we keep collectively developing that capacity and living into the potential that's there of, like you were saying, sourcing from essence and from potential and not just from past experience, because we do need more than incremental change.
Well, I think that's the beauty of, again, this concept of everything's nested and the way we are being actually makes a huge difference. What I'm so excited, I'm so excited about a lot of what your team is working on right now, your internal culture and how you're actively working on creativity coming from any human in the organization and how to do that in a way that isn't a free-for-all, how to do that in an organized manner. And, the new offerings you're creating. But the non-UPF, I'm really, really excited about because the way you are being, the way you are approaching it as an organization is so different. You're not saying, do you meet this standard or not? You're saying, how do we work with the industry and develop the ability for any food company who wants to meet this standard? That's such a different concept. I mean, it sounds a little similar, but it's actually radically different than, are you in or are you out? Are you organic or not? It's like, well, how do we work so that, anyone who wants to not have processed food in their portfolio so that they can, so that it's affordable, so that their processor agrees to take those chemicals out, so that, it's so exciting to think about it as a systemic intervention. And so it's kind of a funny way to answer this question around how does this work grow beyond a small cohort of people? But I think it grows in how we're all showing up and how we're interacting in our environment in different ways. And yeah, I do want to underline something which can feel touchy at times, but I think it's just helpful to name, which is there's kind of two aspects to this. One is the folks that are benefiting the most from our current economic system, from our current political system, are the ones who need to work on examining the sources of their thinking the most. So there's this kind of unfair dynamic that's set up in the way the political, economic, national identity structures of our world work right now. It's like the people who can see that a food company needs to shift the way it's sourcing and the way it's showing up in the world and the way it deals with its employees are maybe not the CEOs. It might be the employees who are not making the most money, right? So that's kind of one aspect to this that I think is very tricky and important to name. And then the other is that, well, and part of that thread is that there are a lot of folks on the planet who don't need to go through the rigorous examine your thinking work and what paradigm are your thoughts coming from, because they're already seeing, we are all part of the whole and we should show up as human beings to each other and let's care for Mother Earth. Like,
which typically is like, in my experience, is people who are not as deeply intertwined with dominant culture.
Exactly.
They just like already get it. They don't need to go through these rigorous.
Yeah. And so then that's kind of the second tricky aspect of this, which is the privilege it is to have this conversation and talk about, the privilege of thinking in a way that doesn't consider everyone and is extractive, and being in that way as a leader in an organization. I've done some really extractive things over the years as a leader of an organization. And the privilege it is to go examine that and take the space to look at it and learn over time and learn in public and fumble with groups of people. And at the same time, the privilege it is to have the trauma in my family lines be in the past. And so, there are so many people on this planet that are currently being traumatized. And so it's like, oh, we all need to nourish ourselves and deal with our traumas and examine our thinking. It's like, you can't do that if you're currently being traumatized. And so also recognizing the privilege it is, I went to herbalism school and have been in this deep exploration of the trauma in my family line and exploring it from a food and herbs and land tending perspective, as well as like a what's still stuck in my body perspective, which is a whole other story for another podcast.
No, I'm like, that's another podcast, Lauren. I want to hear all that.
But I realized I ended up in Ireland this summer and had this really deep experience there. It was my first time in Ireland, and I have a lot of Irish ancestry. And I went to museums and I learned the history of how, I have a lot of British ancestry too. And so how these two places colonized each other and what was the trauma that happened. And, that the potato famine was actually, it wasn't just that there wasn't enough food. It was that the food that was being grown was being exported to England. And so it was a political famine. It wasn't like literally there wasn't enough food. But I was able to process that and do some deep healing work around it that my ancestors couldn't do. But I have the privilege of being many generations removed from the trauma. And so I think that's really important in all of this conversation, to just recognize that we're all coming from different places, different experiences. And what is our relative privilege as we can spend time and effort working on the sources of our thinking and developing ourselves.
For me, one way I reconcile that is like, it builds my will to take responsibility of like, I do have that privilege to do that deep thinking. And so like, it builds my will to use that privilege and do the hard work in service of recognizing that I am part of the bigger whole. And as you've said a couple of times, like, like the healing that I can do within myself does contribute to the healing of the whole, and not in a self-centered way, but in a relational, interdependence-oriented way. Like, if I don't do the hard work that the space of my privilege affords, then that feels out of right relationship to me. And but that's related to the first thing you said of like, for, a lot of that kind of unfair dynamic of like those who are benefiting most from the current system are maybe the least motivated, incentivized to do that work, but also where it's like that's where it's needed the most. So
so let's work on that.
Let's work on that. I'm curious if you have any closing thoughts. The concept of this podcast is becoming like, how do we become the humans that the future needs? And I think like so much of what you've said has spoken directly to that. I'm curious, like, what you are really focusing on in this moment as you move forward with continuing to evolve your contributions and tracking to that curiosity, especially around like, how do we actually nourish ourselves and each other in community and through food? What's most alive for you? And any closing thoughts you want to leave us with?
I think what's most alive for me right now is living a very balanced life. I've spent a lot of my life energy contributing it to work and work projects, and that's taken me, I've flown all over the planet. I've met with so many incredible people. I've gotten a chance to do so many really unusual work-related things in my life. And so I'm really grateful for the role work has played. And I think what I'm honestly most excited about in this moment is spending the time every day to fully nourish my family and myself, and putting the garden and exercise and cooking home cooked meals, like putting all of that on the to-do list first, and then looking at, okay, and at the same time, how am I going to contribute to the evolution of our food system, which is a calling that I just can't shake. And so I know that I'll continue to contribute in many ways, whether it's through, work I'm currently doing with consulting clients in ReNourish, or work that we're considering right now as we regenerate beyond the cohort that we've been doing, or the regenerative market building work. I know that I'm always going to be in service to that. And I think that, again, we can't martyr ourselves. We can't extract from ourselves in service to that, something greater. It has to be in balanced relationship. And so, what I'm most excited about this week is that I picked back up the guitar and played it a little bit in between Zoom calls.
Nice.
It's like those things that are really exciting. And then, on kind of a movement level, I'm really, really curious. The name of ReNourish Studio, to nourish again, to re-nourish, it landed before even the first concept for the first cohort. And so I know there's a lot of track in that name and in what I believe is really needed in our food system right now. And so I'm just really, really excited to follow that thread and see what contribution we get to make next to the greater movement of evolving food. asking this question about, how do we nourish ourselves and the planet simultaneously? And how is it fun instead of really hard? I mean, carbon accounting and ESG accounting, that is really hard. I'm so grateful people do that work, and it's not for me. And, how can this be out of joy and celebration and, bringing about new potential?
Thank you so much. That resonates super deeply with me. I'm excited to follow that thread with you of like, what is all the potential of that concept of ReNourish. And really appreciate you speaking to all of that and everything that you've shared today and everything that you do with the food system and supporting the nourishment of life. Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you, Megan. This was fun.
Thank you for joining us on FutureKind. Remember, every choice we make ripples through the web of life. Until next time, stay curious, stay conscious, and keep making choices that nourish FutureKind. FutureKind is brought to you by the Non-GMO Project and the Food Integrity Collective. New episodes emerge with each new moon. Subscribe now on your favorite podcast platform and share your FutureKind moments with us on social media using #FutureKind. Music by Yaima, Masaru Higasa, and Pepper Proud. Rise Ceremonia 6.